Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about optimizing your DPS for the Tier 7 encounters in Wrath of the Lich King Classic, as well as tips for ranking on those encounters. A number of the tips in this guide are more general and apply to all classes, such as rocket booting out of Gluth's pipe. However, as usual, the guide is very mage focused. This video is a subscriber goal at my Twitch channel, and this is the subject the majority of my followers and subscribers wanted for the next video, so here it is. Thank you all again so much for the support. I really appreciate it. And while a lot of these bosses come down to the fight length and optimizing your cooldowns around that fight length and whatnot, as you know, there isn't much for mechanics, this is what the people wanted. And so I tried my best to point out as much as I can to help optimize your DPS in this first phase of Wrath of the Lich King Classic. As usual, the timestamps are in the description, so you can skip around to different bosses. And in addition to the boss strats, I'm also going to go over Incanter's Absorption spec, general tips for your entire raid if you're really serious about ranking, what Warcraft logs rules are for ranking when it comes to like add damage, world buffs, you know, the number of external CDs allowed, all that. And then I'll also touch on what external raid CDs you can utilize, and also just general cooldown management. So there's a lot, so let's get started. But first, if you like the content, please hit the like and subscribe. That really helps out the videos on YouTube. And also drop me a follow at twitch.tv/Crateria as I continue the road to Twitch partnership. And lastly, join my Discord if you have further questions and for ongoing discussion of mage content. All right, now let's get started. All right, first let's go over the rules handed down to us by the Lumberjack website. Here you can see the Warcraft log rules for rankings in Tier 7, and I have this linked in the description for your convenience. And the main thing here is that all trash is of course excluded from boss ranking, as well as most of all the adds that are in each fight. As you can see here, basically assume that adds and fights don't count for damage, with the only exceptions being the 2 guards on Anub'Rekhan, the followers on Faerlina, but not the worshippers, the first 2 mini bosses on Thaddius, and the soul weavers on Kel'Thuzad. And also for KTZ, the damage from phase 1 does not count. But as I just said, any leftover soul weavers on KTZ will count towards your damage if you're damaging them in phase 2. Next to cover from Warcraft logs is the cap on external raid CDs. So this is primarily for buffs such as power infusion, in that you are now capped to 1 power infusion per encounter. You can get PI from 2 different players, but only if they're spaced out by the amount of time that is the cooldown for a PI. Innervates, however, don't have a cap, so the meta of stacking Innervates as an Arcane Mage is still alive and well, but you know, whatever. We just have to deal with that. Finally, for world buffs, Warcraft logs has essentially taken the stance to blacklist all world buffs with very few exceptions. So currently the only worthwhile exceptions to mention are like Halloween candy and the tailoring buffs from crafting the class. Those are both all allowed. The tailoring buffs are considered part of the profession, and they're also considered pretty minor, so they are allowed. Although they could change their stance on that, but as of right now, that's allowed. However, something which seems minor, such as like plus 25 spell power from Fury of the Ragnaros buff, which can be obtained from using the mind control cap on a mob in Blackrock Depths, that is not allowed. So like I said, all world buffs are not allowed, even if they're kind of minor, like plus 25 spell power. Now, if you want to risk it, you can go get this buff and other buffs. However, just know that if you die in raid, that you will likely get your log disqualified from rankings, because then it'll show up on the log. So you could jeopardize a lot of rankings by doing this. Personally, I think world buffs such as the MC cap one, you know, and others like that aren't a big deal, and I think they should certainly be allowed for launch races where, you know, everyone's going to use them anyways for a launch race since Realm first titles are on the line. But I also don't care to see them get blacklisted on an every week kind of basis. So, you know, it's kind of whatever to me. Use at your own risk, but I'm personally not going to risk it, except for obviously launch race. The one thing I do think should be blacklisted is Spellsteal buffs, which are blacklisted but are hard to detect by Warcraft logs. So, you know, here we can see this ranking, it has way more DPS than even the second one. So let's, you know, take a closer look at this. You know, so here's an example of a log abusing Spellsteal buffs by spellstealing a 2-minute plus 400 spell power buff out in the world and then being summoned into the raid. So if you look at their buffs for the individual counter, you know, there's nothing to be seen here. You can scroll through it, you can see there's nothing to be seen. That's also funny that they're using mage armor instead of molten armor, so they don't even know the right fucking armor to use. But you know, if you look at their damage done, their average arcane blast is doing 17.5k, and that's without AB spam at, you know, they're doing the 4x AB rotation, so that's not even AB spam, so it should be definitely way less than. That's just insanely high, and there's literally no way that's possible without some bullshit Spellsteal buffs. And of course, if you look over the entire raid and go to their buffs, you then scroll down, you see the Spellsteal buff. Of course, they're abusing it, and Now, I'm not going to go into how to get this buff or any of these stupid buffs because they're just that. They're fucking stupid. I know it may seem like a fun thing to get it and blast, and sure, like one time it would be. But do you really want the rankings to be so fucked that anytime you go for rankings, you have to go out into the world and Spellsteal buff and force your raid to summon you back to the raid? Like, for one, you're going to piss off your entire raid by pulling this shit. And if this was allowed, then it would mean every time you wanted to rank on any boss that you'd have to do this shit. It's stupid. And it's why anytime there's a suspicious log like this, just report it to Warcraft logs on their Discord because it's fake. It's not a real ranking, and while rankings are kind of bullshit anyways, just because they rely on a number of things, which a lot of time are out of your control, such as boss RNG, crit rate, how fast your raid kills the boss, you know, what kind of strat your raid does, how many external raid CDs are you getting, such as PI and Innervate, you know, are your priests hymning, where do you want them to, etc., all this bullshit, right? But still, this takes it to a whole new level. So let me know down in the comments what you think, but I personally don't want bullshit like this to become the meta, so I strongly discourage doing it. And if anything, I encourage you to report the fake logs that use this kind of shit to be on top, because they're just that. They're fake. Speaking of external raid CDs, for ranking, you'll want as many Innervates as possible, a power infusion if you can get it, and also hymns of hope from your priests, timed to coincide with the end of the fight. So first, Innervate is obvious for why as Arcane Mages we want this, and as I mentioned in the previous section, it has no cap, so the more you can get, the more you can spam AB, which is more of a DPS increase. And now again, if we look at this graph, we see that AB spam isn't that much more DPS, and it costs a lot more mana. But if you can secure 3 or more Innervates for a fight, then for some of these short fights, you can actually spam AB the entire fight, especially if you smartly utilize Hymn of Hope. So Hymn of Hope is a priest buff which will temporarily inflate your mana for 8 seconds as long as it's used when you're the lowest of the 3 mana users in the raid. So if you use Hymn of Hope towards the end of the fight when you're almost it can allow you to spam AB for that last 8 to 10 seconds of the fight basically. And with 2 hymns back to back, then we're talking spamming AB for the last 18 plus seconds of the fight. Very powerful if you can get your priests on board with the timing of it and time it correctly. Power Infusion is also obvious as an external raid CD, and the one thing to know with this is that the haste benefit of it doesn't stack with Heroism or Lust, so you'll want to use this outside of Heroism and Lust and try and combine it with Trinket procs when you do call for it, if you can do that. However, if the fight is only 50 seconds long or something, then don't wait until after Lust ends to call for it, as you can still get the mana cost reduction benefit from PI even during Lust. So lastly, while Restless Shamans are practically extinct compared to the numbers they had in TBC, if you find yourself in a raid with a Restless Shaman, then try and get in their group as they can drop you Mana Tide Totem for extra mana, and you need to be in their group for that as it only restores mana for those in the group. And for us Alliance players, try and get in a group with the Drain Eye for the 1% hit buff so you can use more non-hit gear for more DPS. So that's an example of your opener, but also your burst window. You want to be stacking your cooldowns as much as possible for your burst window, and you want to have as many burst windows as you can. That said though, as far as cooldown management goes, you don't want to sacrifice a cooldown usage for a burst window. And by that what I mean is, say the fight is going to be 3 minutes, you use all your cooldowns at the start, or maybe a little longer than 3 minutes. Use all the cooldowns at the start like I just showed you. You don't want to wait until Icy Veins comes off cooldown to use your second arcane power, because if you do that, you're going to jip yourself out of an arcane power. As you can see on the timeline on the screen, you could instead use all your cooldowns at the start. As soon as arcane power comes off cooldown, you use arcane power, and then you wait until later on in the fight. Arcane power and Icy Veins will be back up at the same time once again before the fight ends, and you can have that good burst window once again. And same with your trinkets. So your trinket, if you have a 2-minute cooldown on a trinket, you wouldn't want to use it right when it comes off cooldown, because you can just wait until Icy Veins and Arcane Power are off CD for that final burst window before the fight ends, because you know the fight's going to be about 3 minutes. And if the fight's only, say, 2 minutes, though, on the other hand, right, you would use Arcane Power right when it comes off cooldown, because Icy Veins isn't going to be off cooldown before the fight ends, because it's a 2.5 or 2.4 minute cooldown spell. So you have to know what the fight length is for optimal cooldown usage, and you want to maximize your amount of burst windows, but not at the expense of using your CDs. So it's just kind of a little game with knowing how long of a fight is, and you just kind of have to get used to that and get used to knowing how long fights are based on your guild and how fast you kill the bosses. Typically what I do is I just look at the previous week's kills, and I also try and take into account, okay, were there people that died during this encounter? Like, was it really sloppy? Is it going to be maybe better executed this week, and thus it's going to be a lot shorter of a fight length? And then I try and, you know, adjust my cooldown usages based on that. And then if things start to go awry in a fight, a bunch of people die, and you see that it's going to be getting longer, to try and take that into account on the fly. And it's just something you have to get a feel for. But you definitely, it's going to be big for your damage in phase 1 for rankings, and just if you care about your overall damage and whatnot, to maximize that cooldown usage as I just explained. Alright, here's the Incanter's Absorption spec, which can be useful for maximizing your single target damage and thus maximizing boss damage if you're going for rankings. So Incanter's Absorption works by giving you a spell power boost when one of your shields absorbs damage, up to 15% of the absorb when it has 3 talent points. And essentially how this works for most fights is that you fire ward before the bosses pull, and then you use a sapper such as the new global thermal sapper charge to damage yourself and give you the buff when you go to pop cooldowns. And ideally if you're in range of the boss, then you hit them with the sapper damage too. So with the spec you see here, there are some flex points, and you can move points from Magic Attunement to Student of the Mind, basically giving up range on your arcane spells for some more spirit and thus more crit. I prefer range because it gives you the opportunity to precast on a number of the bosses, and an extra arcane blast on these sub-minute fights can be the equivalent of an extra 200 plus DPS, while Student of the Mind is typically like 15-ish DPS per talent point, maybe a little more. Lastly, we pick up Frost Warding because the Sapper can trigger this, and will still also proc your Incanter's Absorption, giving you both the spell power and then also negating the damage and giving you back the mana, so it's a win-win. Now, I don't recommend this spec for overall damage, and it's why I didn't recommend it in my Arcane Mage guide, as it requires dropping Ice Shards, that's extra Blizzard damage and thus less overall damage. However, if you still want Incanter's Absorption spec and also Ice Shards, then you could do a hybrid spec that doesn't take Frost Warding, drop the 2 points from here, and then it also takes 1 less point in Magic Attunement, and then that way you can pick up 3 points in Ice Shards. But I feel like if you're going to go IA, then you're kind of committed to boss damage, and you may as well full commit to overall damage or full commit to boss damage. I will say that there are some top tier mages who actually think that the full IA spec build is better for overall damage, as they feel for their raid, they mainly just Arcane Explosion anyways because their raid moves so fast, and thus they view this spec boosting their overall damage more anyways, since they hardly Blizzard anyways. But I'm skeptical on this, and there are some reasons for that, for why I'm skeptical on it, which I'll get more in depth with a later video, which will be an addendum to my Arcane Mage guide, basically an update. But basically, while I think Arcane Explosion certainly has its use for AoE on the move, I think Blizzard with the Ice Shards still also has its place in a raid, and I still think taking Ice Shards is still superior for overall damage. Also because if you go Incanter's Absorption build, then you can't Sapper on Trash, and a good Sapper on Trash is a shit ton of damage. So, like I said, I would commit to either an overall damage build or a boss damage build personally. That said, the trash melts and knacks anyways, and spamming AE the entire time for AoE is still going to be great DPS. So if you want to go this spec to try and get a little better rankings on some bosses and sacrifice a little overall damage for it, then go for it in my opinion. Just make sure you adjust your AoE on trash accordingly. I mean, honestly, for farm weeks, someone fucking up and dying on trash is going to be more of a time loss than going full IA spec over Ice Shards. So really, if someone thinks you're griefing the raid, tell them, you know, that the extra 20 seconds you're causing the raid to last longer doesn't fucking matter in a million years unless it's an actual speed run. And this spec is obviously not for speed running anyways, so yeah. One last thing to note with the build is that you can also use Mana Shield in combination with Dark Runes and Demonic Runes to not only restore mana from the runes, but then this damage from the Demonic Runes and Dark Runes on your damage shield will proc Incanter's Absorption. Now just be careful that if you don't have good mana support in your raid, that depending on the fight, you'll want to macro in a /cancel aura mana shield into a separate macro. Otherwise you'll take damage in the encounter, and while that will give you a nice IA proc, it will also drain like 4k plus of your mana, which depending on your raid environment, how long the fight is, you know, etc., this can be a net negative to your DPS, so by losing that mana. So you could macro in the cancel aura into your kitchen sink macro if it's done correctly. However, some people have reported that if you have the cancel aura in like that kitchen sink macro, where you cancel the mana shield in the same macro as you're using your dark rune, that sometimes it cancels the mana shield before you actually get the damage benefit. So it seems like, you know, it has to do with how you set up the macro maybe, but personally I wouldn't risk it. It's because it's not completely known. I would just macro it into something else, somewhere else to be safe. So after your kitchen sink macro, just have a separate macro to cancel aura the mana shield. However, if you're rocking multiple innervates and you've worked with your priest to time hymns and whatnot, then you probably don't need to cancel aura that mana shield, and thus you could pre-cast mana shield before a fight for a large Incanter's Absorption proc from raid damage, which can be a definite DPS increase for you if you got that really good mana support. Lastly, if you're getting shielded by priests, ask them to shield you after your sapper so that their shield doesn't absorb the sapper, and also add in a cancel aura into your kitchen sink macro to cancel off the power word shield so that it doesn't eat the absorb, and that way your shields eat the absorb and you actually get the Incanter's absorption proc. Some general tips for your entire raid to help you rank are that you want Lust right away at the start, just a couple GCDs in to maximize stacking with pre-pots, and you also want your entire raid to rocket boot into range of the boss, certainly the melee, and although if you have ranged precast on the boss, then precast on the boss. And for mages, this is an advantage for getting range in your spec, as you can precast on a number of the bosses, which is an extra AB cast on that boss essentially. Also, a number of the fights don't require Jack for healing, so it's great to have your healers go a DPS spec off spec for these fights, or at least DPS as much as they can as their healing spec in order to reduce the kill time. For mages, Palm and Mirror Image should be saved for movement, and you should combine them with Rocket Boots depending on the boss. Otherwise, if there's no real movement in the fight, then for Mirror Image, just make sure you use it outside of cooldowns with at least 30 seconds left in the fight. And nowadays on a number of the tank and spanks, I just use it right after my first precast AB. And for Palm on tank and spanks, use it at higher AB stacks and also use it outside of haste CDs. For mages, for your arcane rotation, for ranking you want to use a higher rotation with your CDs. So what I mean by that is, fish as you need to during your arcane power. So if you don't have a missile barrage proc, just keep fishing until you get that missile barrage proc even at 4x AB. Unless the kill time is really long and you don't have much for mana support, in which case, doing that will likely be a net negative because it's going to cause you to have to evocate later on in the fight when you wouldn't have had to if you didn't do that, or it's going to, use a lower rotation later in the fight. Then it wouldn't be worth it if it causes you to do those things. But if you have a good amount of mana support, multiple innervates, then you could even spam AB during that entire arcane power part, depending on the fight length. And again, only if you can afford to do that though. So i.e. it doesn't cause you to have to evocate or use a lower rotation later in the fight because of that extra AB spam. For some fights such as a nub though, again, if you have a couple innervates, you can practically AB the entire time. This is, this isn't always the case, so just remember to use a higher rotation during CDs, but again, only if you can afford it. That's basically the general rule. Also try to end your last 1.5 seconds of arcane power with a missile barrage arcane missiles, or at least when doing your 4x AB rotations during arcane power, don't do the rotation in a way that leads you to restacking your AB debuff during the last few seconds of arcane power. Ideally, you want to perform your 4x rotation so that you start your arcane power at higher stacks and also end either at 4x AB debuff stacks or ending with the missile barrage arcane missiles from 4x AB stacks. And this is why I typically use my kitchen sink macro at 3x AB stacks now, because as long as I get the missile barrage procs, then the rotation works out just right there. Although if I have a lot of mana support, then I'll pop my CDs at 4x stacks and spam AB for the majority of my arcane power. This is typically a short fight, so don't pre-pot unless your raid still has a longer kill time. Use rocket boots with Palm and Mirror Image to get within 10 yards for Sapper to hit the boss and adds, and try and be off to one of his sides to minimize any overlap with other raiders to avoid the spike cast. Pray that you don't get hit with the spike, and if you do, blink instantly down to the ground to continue casting. Also, if you have decent mana support here and it's a quick kill, then you can probably afford to spam AB during your AP window, and so if so, do that. However, if that's going to cause you mana issues later on in the fight, then it's not worth it. This fight is short enough where you should ideally be able to fish for an M-bar proc however much you need to. And also, if you're getting PI, then the fight might be so short that you should call for PI before Lust ends to still benefit from the mana cost reduction. Again, another short fight, so this might not be worth pre-potting depending on your situation. Use rocket boots with Palm at the start to get in position if your raid's going to kill her where she stands, and otherwise if your raid is going to drag her to the entrance as she's close to dying, then save your rocket boots and Palm to reposition mid-fight in case that's needed. Follower damage does count on her, but they die quick, so just focus on her instead. Don't bother with the ads. And don't rocket boots in close for Sapper as you risk getting silenced. So if you're Incanter's Absorption spec, then Sapper for the buff, but if not, then use Serenite Bomb at the start, macroed in with an AB to be able to hit all the mobs. And your heroes should be able to heal through the Rain of Fire, so don't bother moving for that. And if you're IA spec, then you're hoping for that to actually happen, because that's going to get you a good proc. If you have a shit ton of mana support and your guild kills this quick, then again, you can spam AB during CDs. And if you're IA spec, you could even leave Mana Shield up in hopes of getting hit with Volley and Rain of Fire to proc AI some more. This will drain a ton of mana, but again, if you have really good support, then it should be extra damage and reduce any pushback from the Volley too. Again, another short fight where it might not be worth pre-potting depending on your situation. Rocket boots into position, but try to stay 20 yards from where she'll be positioned to help you with your invis later. I'll talk about that in a second. And praise that you don't get web wrapped, and for rankings purposes, try to rotate assignments between your fellow ranged DPS for breaking people out on a week-by-week basis. And now the reason you want to try and stay at a 20-yard range from her is because you can invis to dodge the web spray. So when there's about 1.8 seconds before her web spray is about to go out, then hit the invis, and this is because it takes 2 seconds for invis to go off. Ignore the tooltip which says 3 seconds, that's wrong, it's 2 seconds. And you want invis to go off right after she web sprays. And then you want to cancel the invis pretty much right after that so you can start blasting her again. Ignore the ads, they don't count. And if you're IA spec, then you can be within 10 yards of the hitbox for that extra sapper damage, but know that the closer you are, the harder it is to get the invis off, so there's a trade-off there. Patchwerk is the tank and spank fight, so there isn't anything special here. So I'll just say that the fight lengths are usually around 2 minutes, so plan your CDs based on that, but obviously look at your own kill times for that. And follow what I mentioned in the general gameplay for ranking section, get a good pull with melee rocket booting in there, and get that lust out early with the pre-pot. Rocket boots yourself in if you can't get close enough to pre-cast, and you know, again, Incanter's Absorption, do the Incanter's Absorption things. And you know, also you can rocket boots with your palm as you're moving in to get within 10 yards so that your sapper is also going to hit for a tiny bit extra damage too, even if you're not Incanter's Absorption. Depending on how your raid kites Grobbulus, position yourself so that you aren't in front of the tank, but you are also up as far in position as you can be to minimize the amount of time you need to move. Ideally, you're in a spot where you can turret and turn to DPS the boss as he's kited around the corners. You know, save your mirror image and palm for when you do need to move to keep up with the tank, and you can also use rocket boots for quick movement with mirror image or palm. Just know that if you use your rocket boots here, then you won't have them for Gluth's pipe, and you'll have to use your TBC rocket boots on the Gluth pole and swap back to your regular boots for that, which is, you know, just a little annoying, but just something to keep in mind. Unfortunately, many guilds still kite Grobbulus along the sides of the wall, which makes it more difficult for the casters. So if your guild has fast kill times, then try to convince them to kite him closer to the center of the room in a circle, because you don't need to use the walls. That's a bad habit left over from vanilla, I think. If you get hit with the debuff, then blast until it's close to falling off and blink out of range of everyone, and then rocket boots back to a good position. Lastly, on 25-man, you'll be stuck in combat after the boss, so invis right away after the boss is dead to drop combat right away so that you can get mana back, and also you can swap your TBC rocket boots if that's needed. Slowfall yourself in the pipe, and unless your guild has a very fast kill, then pre-pot right before the tank leaves the pipe. Then, once the tank has left the pipe, wait for them to hit the boss, and as soon as they do, rocket boots out of the pipe, and as you float past Gluth, use your palm, fire blast, and mirror images. You should then land in a spot where you shouldn't have to move as Gluth is kited back to the back wall, and you can just turret for DPS. And if you're running IA spec, you can also time your sapper as Gluth is kited by for a little extra damage. If you used boots on the previous boss, then you can use TBC rocket boots in the pipe and swap back to your main boots before getting into combat. It's just a little bit more of a pain, and you will fly really far with your TBC rocket boots, so you may want to angle your pipe exit a little bit, but it's a good alternative in case your boots are on CD. Thaddius is interesting cooldowns wise due to the nature of the fight with the buff you get once you engage Thaddius. However, we don't want to save all cooldowns until then, because Lust doesn't happen until later on in the fight when we get that damage buff, and when we get that damage buff is well over a minute into the fight. So it's still better to use some CDs at the start of the encounter, and what CDs you should use is determined by whether your raid Lust right after that first polarity shift, which is about, you know, a minute something into the fight, or whether they save it until the execute phase. Basically, for us mages, we should be using pre-pot gloves and arcane power all at the start, and if your lust won't come until the last 40 seconds of the fight, you know, i.e. during the execute phase, then you could even icy veins here at the start too, as it'll come back up off CD by the end of the fight to be combined with lust. Save your mana gem until the first damage buff goes out, the polarity, and save mirror image and palm for movement between the polarity shifts. To help make the jump, you can slow fall over, and if you have a fair amount of mana support through Innervates, Mana Tide, etc., then you can use this downtime between the mini-bosses and Thaddius to also evocate, even if you only need a couple ticks of that evocate, since you have all that good mana support to get you through the rest of the fight. If you're Incanter's Absorption spec, also use this transition time to Fire Ward so that you can get an IA proc off with a Sapper once you get the damage buff. And use your CDs as I've mentioned based on your guild's kill time and where the loss will happen. And if you have to switch sides, always do the palm last, i.e. Fire Blast, then Palm AB, or Mirror Image and then Palm AB, as using the palm later will keep your stacks refreshed enough so that they aren't dropped by the time you move across and start casting again. Also, if your Mirror Image and Palm are on CD, then blink across. Also think about Thaddius' polarity as a CD, so when he does the transition and you lose the damage buff, try and be conscious of that, as you don't want to use your high damage Missile Barrage proc at 4 stacks right as he casts polarity shift and you lose the damage buff. And so instead, either use the M-Bar proc at 3 stacks before he does the polarity switch, or if you have the mana to spare, AB at higher stacks until you get the damage buff back again, and then Missile Barrage. However, that is only if you have really good mana support, as this is a really long fight, so you likely can't afford to spam AB at 4 stacks any more than you have to for the rotation amount you're using, but it's something you can do if you can afford it. And yeah, again, it's a long fight, so if you're watching this and you don't have much for mana support, or you have a really long kill time with your raid, just remember the basics and drop to a lower AB rotation outside of CDs to help with mana. And for you fire boys and girls, the only thing to add is to use your Living Bomb and Hot Streak procs for movement, and also try and use your Hot Streak procs during the damage buff if it isn't in jeopardy of being overwritten or falling off. You could save it until you get the damage buff. And ensure you use Combustion during the damage buff plus Trinket procs. For Noth, if you have to decurse, then wait to pop CDs until the first curse goes out, then use all your CDs, but for rankings purposes, try and rotate decurse assignments so that there's weeks that you won't have to decurse at all. Pre-pot only if your fight length is 113 or longer, and if you don't have to decurse, then it's a tank and spank, so just ignore the ads, pop CDs once triggers proc, etc. Pre-pot and pre-cast if you can, and cast Arcane Blast while the tank pulls him off the platform. Then use Rocket Boots with Palm AB and Fire Blast to keep up DPS while getting onto the platform. By now, hopefully hero has gone out, and treat it like a tank and spank with your gameplay and your CDs. Just keep in mind to stay 30 yards away from him, or you can get hit with a 300% slower cast speed debuff, and if you do get hit by that, ice block it off right away. Depending on how your guild kites Heigan through the zones, you may need to reposition while on the platform to stay in the range of the boss, and if so, use Mirror Image during that movement, or Arcane Barrage if you had that to be able to reposition and stay within range of the boss. Lastly, if your raid isn't killing Heigan before the dance, then here's a clip of me doing the dance. Basically, to maximize your damage here, always be on the edge of a zone to minimize movement, allowing you to finish a cast after the eruption has gone out, and still allowing enough time to move to safety. And utilize Blink smartly in this manner as well to move across 2 zones quickly, allowing you to squeeze in some more casts. And if you know your guild has to dance for Heigan, then save Rocket Boots for the dance so that you can Rocket Boots when moving across the zones to squeeze in some more casts. Also, utilize your Palm to help keep stacks up, of course. Arcane Barrage off CD if you have Arcane Barrage, and Fire Blast off CD as well. And use your Missile Barrage procs at lower stacks if you get caught in a situation where your AB stacks are going to fall off before you can get another AB cast off, as it's better to Missile Barrage at the lower stacks and utilize those debuff stacks than to just simply let them fall off. To maximize your cooldowns for Loatheb, it'll come down to when your group gets Spore and when your raid uses Heroism or Lust. If they Lust after 4 Spores go out, then still do a pre-pot and also use Gloves at the start, as they should come back up during Heroism. If your raid Lust towards the end of the fight during Execute phase, then look at the previous week's kill time and determine how to maximize your cooldowns based on my CD management tutorial. And if your kill time is well under 3 minutes, then note that you won't want to use Icy Veins at the start, but if it's close to 3 minutes or longer, then you can use Icy Veins at the start and have it back up for Heroism and Lust. That's again, if your raid is lusting at the Execute phase. Basically, only use Icy Veins at the start if your guild saves Heroism or Lust until the end, and your guild has a longer kill time of close to 3 minutes or longer. Additionally, if they Lust towards the end of the fight, but you get one of the first Spores, then save Gloves and Arcane Power until you get that first Spore debuff, but typically my raids I never get the first Spore debuff, it's always a later group. Also save your Palm and Mirror Image to DPS on the move while moving to the Spore, and also only move if you have to, i.e. once you get the Spore debuff, just plant your feet and turret the boss until you have to do a Spore refresh, or if you have to move for some other reason. For the second Spore refresh, your Rocket Boot should be off CD, and you should be able to Rocket Boots to that next Spore while using instant cast abilities on the move. And for Incanter's Absorption Spec Mages, if you have good mana support, you can also Mana Shield before the pull to get an IA proc from the damage that the boss pumps out during the fight. Again, this will cost you mana, so only if you have at least an Innervate is this probably worth. And Fire Mages, use Combustion at the start with CD procs, as Combustion loses value once you get the Spore debuff, so you want to just use it at the start before you get your Spore debuff. And also utilize your Living Bomb refresh and Hot Streak procs for movement to the Spores. Instructor Razuvious is pretty straightforward. Rocket Boots into position, and if your raid has some wonkiness when it comes to holding aggro on this boss, I've seen that in a number of raids, then save Mirror Image as an oh shit moment for when that happens. Otherwise, pretty much tank and spank for us. But Incanter's Absorption Spec Mages, note that if you have good mana support, then a pre-casted Mana Shield can proc off the Shouts and Dagger Throws for good IA procs. Gothik doesn't count towards All-Stars and is a joke encounter, so level your wand to 400 off him and do it else. Hopefully your raid does at least a 3-stack strat for a fast 4 Horsemen kill time, and if not, you can try and convince them to, but regardless, try and maximize your CDs based on your raid strat, fight length, and also Lust timing. For a 3 stack, hopefully your ranged is stacked close enough to the stacked bosses so that your sapper will hit all 3 bosses, and it's likely best to wait on using the sapper until it will hit all 3 instead of just the first horseman pulled to the corner, even if that means the sapper and IA proc come a little bit on the tail end of your CDs. Also, as usual, if your Incanter's Absorption spec and have good support, then Mana Shield here will proc off the mark damage for some extra IA procs. Also, Blink and Rocket Boots for transitioning to Zeliek, or vice versa if your guild does a burn Zeliek strat at first. And lastly, for Fire Mages, be sure to multi-dot your Living Bomb for cleave damage and just more damage in general. For pre-pot here, you want to pre-pot right as Sapphiron explodes as a white cloud. If you are decursing, then wait to pop your CDs until after you're done decursing, and same goes for subsequent decursing. You know, basically don't pop your CDs right before a curse goes out. For rankings purposes, try and rotate the decurse assignment each week, so that you can each have a chance to rank. Save Rocket Boots with Palm and Mirror Images for movement to an ice block, and remember that you don't have to be right behind an ice block. You just need to have it anywhere between you and Sapphiron, meaning you could technically be back against the wall, and as long as you position just right with the ice block between you and Sapphiron, then you're safe. Spam cast while behind the ice block to start casting as soon as you can, and hopefully you only get one air phase. If you're IA spec, then again with good mana support, you could Mana Shield in addition to a ward, and also while many still use Fire Wards for Saph ranking, I think Frost Ward is the play, as it should be guaranteed to fully get knocked off due to the Saph aura, while you only get a full Fire Ward absorb if your Sapper crits. Also, use the time that you're behind the ice block to refresh your Frost Ward for some more Incanter's Absorption procs. Phase 1 damage doesn't count, but leftover Soul Weavers do, so finish them off if they're in your area. However, ideally you're able to be positioned ready to focus KTZ as soon as he becomes active. Remember to coordinate beforehand with anyone giving you raid CDs such as Innervator PI, where they're going to be standing so that you're in range of them. Obviously, make sure you're positioned 10 plus yards away from everyone and praise that you don't get targeted with some bullshit. Save Palm for it if you get targeted with Void Zone so you can keep DPSing while moving out of that. And if you're in Incanter's Absorption spec, precast Frost Ward before KTZ becomes active for the Frostbolt volleys, and continue to Frost Ward on CD to continue to get IA procs from the Frostbolt volleys. Also, before KTZ becomes active, you can Invis to drop combat and drink to get mana back. So you can also utilize this time to swap gear around because it drops you from combat. So you can Invis 45 seconds before KTZ becomes active and swap your trinkets to put them on CD so that they'll be ready to proc as soon as he becomes active, and thus you can avoid a situation where they proc on a Soul Weaver right before he becomes active. You can also utilize a macro which uses Innkeeper Water and percent food such as Halloween Candy or Festive Dumplings to restore mana to full very quickly when you go to drink out of the Invis. You have to do 3 Drake for ranking, so I'm going to make the assumption you're doing 3D here. Your raid could be doing burn strat or non-burn strat, and could be using hero when the first Drake lands or the second Drake, as I've been in raids that do both. So obviously, depending on what your raid does, min-max your CDs based on the fight length and lust timing, although this is a fight where, for most raids, due to the difficulty of it, you need to maximize your CDs for damage on the Drakes instead of the overall damage, i.e. your Sarth damage at the beginning doesn't help you clear the encounter, as the difficult part is killing the Drakes. So basically what I'm saying is, if your guild is still struggling to kill this boss to a certain extent, then do your part and save your CDs for that first rank. Still pre-pot, but because it'll be back up by the time the first rank comes down and whatnot. But especially because, you know, rankings wise, if you aren't doing the burn strat, it's going to be very difficult for you to get a high ranking anyways. So ads do contribute to that damage, and so when your raid calls for it, help AoE down the ads, and depending on the tank picking them up, save Mirror Image for that scenario can be useful, you know, so that way you don't rip threat on all the ads. So I like to save Mirror Image for that. Otherwise, you know, you could use your Mirror Image and Palm for movement from the lava walls, and remember that you can blink through lava wall if you time it right, in the off chance that that's useful for you. Now for burn strat raids, Chad Incanter's Absorption spec users can sit in lava ahead of time with Fire Ward and Mana Shield and keep drinking until pull time, and then you want to Rocket Boots from the lava to get in range to pre-pot and pre-cast with the pull timer, and ideally you recast Fire Ward right before the pull so that you have a full Fire Ward to get another IA proc when you sapper with your CDs. Malygos no longer contributes to all-star rankings, but for the sake of your character sheet page on Warcraft logs and simply to maximize encounter damage in raid, I'll still cover it. So pre-pot and pre-cast before the tank activates the orb, and use your gloves at the start as they'll be back up before you want to pop CDs for a double spark stack. Save your instant cast for when he vortexes, and sometimes you can still cast AB during this time. Other times you can't, but try to see if you can. If you can't, use your instant cast, and if you're IA spec, use this time to cast Fire Ward right before the vortex ends. Presumably your raid is doing a double spark stack, so hero will likely be used with the first spark, but wait until the second spark is dragged in and popped to use all your CDs. Again, if your Incanter's Absorption spec, make sure to Sapper before your Fire Ward falls off, which will likely be before the second spark comes in. But save the rest of your CDs for that second spark, but make sure you do get your Sapper off before the Fire Ward falls off. Pop all CDs there once you get that second spark coming in, and then pump into the boss. And then for the adds, be sure to Spellsteal the haste buff, as those haste buffs will stack, and they're such a boost that you can do basically a full blizzard in 1 second, as well as a full evo in under a second too. So that's huge damage there. So use that blizzard then to AoE down the adds on the ground. And then continue to use any sparks for extra damage while DPSing the adds, but only if your healers can keep you up while you're not in one of the bubbles. Also, if you're fire, this is your fight, as you can go ham on the add phase by just constantly multi-dotting everything with Living Bomb, especially with the extra range on Living Bomb. If you have that in your spec, you can basically reach most mobs from wherever your spark is. And then finally the vehicle phase, it's the vehicle phase, just 1-2, then 1-1-2, repeat, and trust in your healers. Alright guys, I hope that was helpful, and I realized that a lot of those strats, it's not like that's what I was doing in the video, so there's a mismatch between what I'm doing in the video and the strats. Haven't quite got them down or the opportunity to do full rankings yet myself, just based on the way Fusion does their raids as well as the GDKPs I was in, but those are the strats that I feel are best, so definitely follow them if you want to do some good rankings, and that's what I got. Let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are and if I missed anything, and again, please like and subscribe if you like the content. It really does help me out, as well as drop me a follow at twitch.tv/Crateria. Stop in for a stream as I do the road to Twitch partnership. And lastly, join the Discord if you want to ask any further questions, join in some mage discussion, etc. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and hope you enjoy the bonus clip. Cheers. What is going on? I want an adult. I've been kidnapped. He's trying to hop over it, but the fucking the Tundra Mammoth is too. Oh, it actually did. Oh no. Wait, does this hurt both of us? Oh my god. Hold on. Oh yeah. See, I know how to sequence break this game. Why do you trust this man? Hey! fucking, you know, you're dead. Yeah. Man! No! Fuck.